Hello, my name is Gary Johnson. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources. And today we're going to be discussing community gravel beds as alternatives for communities that need to reforest, but in particular for those communities that are working with limited budgets. So as we go through, these are the 7 sections that I'm going to be discussing as we go through, and hopefully they'll make sense as we touch on them. So before we get really into the meat of this discussion, there are a few little bit of nomenclature that's kind of unique to tree nurseries and not so intuitive to people that are either foresters or normal people. So when we talk about gravel for a gravel bed, you can use a lot of different types of gravel, and they can range from 3/8 of an inch in diameter to 3/4 of an inch, and we've used all of those. Washed gravel is usually the preferred gravel because it's rounded and it rolls off the roots easily when you harvest the trees. Bare root plants, that's pretty intuitive. These are trees that have been grown in nurseries in the field and then harvested with no soil around the roots. Liners, these are woody plants that most of the time, liners are sold to other nurseries. And then those nurseries, like a retail nursery, will grow those on to larger sizes and then market them as, 8, 10, 12, 14-foot tall trees. Whips are liners, and they look like a whip, quite honestly, and they're bare rooted. They're just as frequently unbranched as they are with light branches on them. So that's basically those types of trees. A calipered tree, however, is a tree that these are what most people buy in retail nurseries. And caliper is the width of the stem of the tree measured at approximately 6 inches above the first main order root. So if you go to most nurseries, or if you look at the trees that most communities plant on their boulevards, most of the time those are going to be between 1 3/4 and 2-inch caliper trees. That seems to be a size of a tree that looks like a tree. The last thing on here is the ANSI Z60.1. You should enter this and save it on your smartphone. This is your assurance that when you're buying nursery stock, that it meets the standards for these ANSI standards that were developed by the American Nurseryman Association. So this is your protection for size, for the quality of the plant, and that you're getting exactly the plant that you ordered. So now we're going to look at gravel as a healer, and notice that I did not misspell healer. I do not advocate gravel beds to be growing beds. These are temporary places to heal in. That's why it's spelled that way. The roots to keep them moist until you have time to plant them out in the landscape. So when you buy bare rooted trees in the spring, it's important to know that they were actually harvested from the field the previous autumn. And then they're put in cold storage, and then they start shipping them out, depending on the part of the country, between February and May is when they get shipped out. Healing has been a nursery practice for literally hundreds of years. And in this photograph, the healing bed to the left, that's using real coarse sand. To the right is sawdust. Sand works well, sawdust works well too. But Pea Stone has some real advantages to it. And the big advantage is when you lift the bare rooted tree out of the healed in bed with Pea Stone, the stones just roll right off. You really don't lose any roots unless you intentionally cut them off. So that's the big advantage of Pea Stone versus finer sands, and especially versus like wood chips or an organic mulch, that the roots tend to grow right into those organic mulches, and you lose a lot of the roots when you lift them. So when we're looking at a material that's going to be optimum for healing in these roots, we want to keep this optimum oxygen and moisture ratio. It has to have enough oxygen in there for the roots to respire and continue to grow. And it needs enough moisture that they don't dry out. but you can have too much moisture too. So they need to make sure that the gravel bed has good drainage. It's always nice if the material that you're using to heal in doesn't break down. And Pea Stone, not in our lifetime, is not going to break down. So you can just keep using it over and over and over again. Another nice thing about gravel is you're not going to have problems with disease or insects as you would with a more organic type of material for healing in. There's nothing for diseases or insects to live on. It's rocks. It's recyclable. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when you lift the trees, there's hardly any root loss. Commercially, gravel beds have been used for quite a few years. This is a Jim Whiting nursery in Rochester, Minnesota. And this is about 1/3 of an acre. And I'll talk more about this type of gravel bed in size, 1/3 of an acre in size. And he's been selling that wholesale and retail for 30 years now in 2023. One of the real advantages, and actually this is how our research at the University of Minnesota started, was back in the early 2000s. We were looking at, can we help pot-bound plants recover from that encircling root system and build a better root system? If you look at the red arrow on here, you can see this kind of squared off soil root. And I'm going to talk about how we create that box system later, but all the other roots growing like towards you in the screen, those have all been regenerated in a Pea Stone gravel bed. And notice how they're no longer encircling. They grow right straight out. Another way of building better root systems, this is not at all unusual for calipered bur oaks in this case. Bur oak has been one of our bigger challenges. And the challenge a lot of times start when you get the plants. When they're dug from the field, their root systems are pretty darn sparse. And the larger they are, the more difficult it is for the trees to establish. When you place these trees, and there's going to be some species differences too that we'll discuss. But when you place these trees in gravel, the fine root system just explodes in there. It has all the energy it needs. It's already stored in the tree because, remember last autumn, it was still growing in the field. And so it has the energy, and now you put it in a system with optimum oxygen and moisture, and the fine roots just explode out. This is one of our earlier studies, and this actually has some relevance to, I think, your community or your organization. But we were trying to develop better liners with better root systems. So we started playing around, except we're researchers, so we don't play around. We experiment. It's a fancy word for playing around with different mixes. And we had larger stone, we had the Pea Stone, we had Pea Stone mixed with sand, and we had Pea Stone mixed with water holding materials. Basically, it's expanded clay. And in this randomized study, we looked at all the root responses, different species too. And in the end, a couple things came out of it. Plain old Pea Stone, just 100% Pea Stone. If you're going to do one thing, that's what you go to. If you want to give it a little bit more water holding, personality to it, go 90% Pea Stone and 10% of the coarsest sand you can find. And those ended up being our best media for growing trees in. Another thing that we started too, because with the nut species are notorious for sending out tap roots, and it takes them a while to form a good fibrous root system. Well, so we started direct sowing seeds in gravel, and this is what we got. This is with black walnut, one of those trees that notoriously has a taproot system. And these trees are about 3 months old, and look at the fibrous root system on it. It's just perfect. This is what you want. Again, this is a bur oak, and you can see we direct sowed the acorns. And right away, instead of having a dominant taproot system, look at all the fine roots that are developing off of this. And this is white oak, even better. So if you want to start some trees from seeds, and we've grown a lot of them from seed in Pea Stone, give it a shot, give it a try. The only problem you may have would be squirrels or streaking gophers or something. So sometimes you have to put like a screen or some type of protection over the gravel to keep those little critters from digging down in. Okay, we also worked with rooted cuttings. So this is Manchurian ash. And these are cuttings that were rooted in pretty sparse roots, and then we put them in gravel. And this is about 6 weeks later in gravel. So you can see this explosion of fine roots in it. Now, man, this is a name, a term, rehabilitation, that I stole from somebody very close to you, that I think reflects exactly what we're doing. So a lot of times with the containerized root systems, when you purchase them, especially towards the middle or the end of the season, they have encircling roots. I mean, really packed in woody encircling roots. And one of the problems with that is they stay encircling unless you do something about it. Another issue that we often find too is that the trees are buried too deeply in that container. You want that first main order root when you go to plant them in the landscape to be within 1 inch of the soil surface. So we developed a couple techniques for correcting that. And one of them is, like in the previous slide, we determine how much excess soil is over that first main order root. And we literally saw it off with an old pruning saw, making sure we don't cut into the stem. Okay, that takes care of the depth. Now we want to take care of these encircling roots, and especially this photo is not too bad. They're pretty fine roots. Those are no big deal. You don't even really need to do anything with those. But if the encircling roots are about the diameter of a pencil, like you see in some of these, then you need to do something. So we came up with this solution that has worked 100% of the time, and it's called boxing. And if you've ever been to a Greek restaurant and you've seen them slice off meat for a gyro, that's kind of what you're doing here. You go in about 1 inch from the edge of the container and go around 4 sides, and you just saw that off. You box it. So if you look at the pot-bound river birch to the left, it's freshly boxed, so it's no longer a round root system. It's kind of squared off. And then we put it in pea stone, gravel bed. And if you look at it, that's the very same plant 5 weeks later. You see this explosion of fine roots, but more importantly, none of them are encircling anymore. So there are a lot of uses for community gravel beds, saving money, building better root systems, recovering pot-bound plants. And the nice thing is they're very space efficient and you're not wasting good soil. So I'm going to take you through a number of communities now and show you different styles of gravel beds, ones that we recommend, ones that we highly recommend, and ones that we say, don't ever do that. Just not so good. NSG, not so good. So this is in Morris, Minnesota. This is a raised bed. They've just burned up soil to the outside of it a little bit. And this is fairly typical. It's a good starter bed. But before we go to any of these beds, I think it's important one more time to look at the economics of it. And this is based on prices of nursery stock in the upper Midwest, all for the same size of a tree. This would be 1 3/4 to a 2-inch caliper tree. And you can see the incredible savings that you make on a bare root tree of this large size, 1 3/4 to 2-inch caliper tree. A lot cheaper than a balled and burlap plant, and it's a lot lighter too. A bare root 2-inch caliper tree is going to weigh about 20 pounds. A balled and burlap 2-inch caliper tree is going to weigh about 350 pounds. And then a containerized tree is somewhere in the middle. It's heavier, it's more expensive. Then it has the issue with the encircling roots. So here's another community. It's another raised bed. This is in Hendricks, Minnesota. And this is typical for a community too. All volunteers built that. We were on site to provide technical assistance, but you can see this is above ground. It's about 15 inches of gravel in there. The outside supports, I'll talk more about that later, on this one are every 4 feet on center. I recommend doubling that up, every 2 feet on center. But they've been using this bed since 2009. And each year, for this community of about 750 people, they put in and then they harvest about 75 trees that are planted in their parks and in their boulevards. So constructing these raised beds, this is generally how you start. You want to get rid of any organic matter, living organic matter. So if you're going to build on soil, which, I really don't recommend putting gravel on top of good productive soil. But in this particular place, they didn't have a choice. So scraped off the sod, organic material, and then start putting in your corner post, your 4-corner post, squaring it up and leveling it. Now, squaring it up, this is your chance to use that Pythagorean theorem that you had to learn in geometry class, and you probably have wondered, when am I ever going to use this? You're going to use it if you want to square something up. You do not have to have a perfectly square gravel bed. It's just a matter of pride when people look at it and see that it is square, it is level, and it looks more professional. It looks better than just somebody throwing together some boards and posts and dumping some gravel in there. It's an aesthetic thing. We also recommend no nails. We recommend all pressurized wood materials, and then use bolts and screws, galvanized obviously, instead of nails. And this allows you, if the time comes to take it apart, you can take it apart and move it somewhere else. You can take it apart and use the lumber for something else. So nothing is destroyed. Those posts are not set in concrete. They're just set right down in the soil. And the rule of thumb is if you have a post that's 18 inches above ground, you want a minimum of 18 inches below ground. I would probably get a 4-foot post, 18 inches above ground, 3.5 feet below ground. And that makes them nice and solid. You don't need concrete. And, depending on the community, you can get kind of innovative with how you construct this. This particular community was right next to the machine shop. So they had these L braces created for them, cut the length, and this really stiffened up the corners and just it made a stronger and better bed for them. Some of the communities have used landscape timbers, and again, NSG, it means not so good. I would not recommend using landscape timbers. For one thing, they will warp on you. Contrary to what you're going to be told, they're going to warp. And if they're an edging, partially buried underground, it's no big deal. But if they're sticking above ground like this, they split, they warp. They're not perfectly square, and so it ends up you put a lot of work into something like this, and it doesn't look that great. By the way, if you decide to use this, if you decide that I'm crazy and you want to go ahead and use these are attached by drilling all the way through, and then use a 3/8 reinforcing bar. It's called rebar. And you can get these from any hardware store, lumberyard, et cetera. And then you pound those rebars through the holes, and that anchors everything together. And that first course of landscape timbers, half of it's going to be below ground. And that's going to help preventing the bottom from kicking out. Oops, didn't mean to do that. There we go. All right. This is in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. They poured this concrete. This was an old alleyway by the maintenance building, and they poured this concrete specifically for parking and for the gravel bed. And when they poured this concrete, if you look at these metal posts to the outside, these are actual round metal poles. And where they go down to the concrete, they put PVC piping in there. So these poles actually slip right down into the PVC pipes that are embedded in the concrete, which is really slick. And then the poles, these posts, and these happen to be between 2 and 4 feet on center, those are bolted then into the sideboards. But again, with this one, if they ever decide they want to move this better, or they need more parking, or they have more trees they can manage, easy peasy to take this whole thing apart. And the nice thing is you haven't covered up good productive soil. If you can't build it on an old concrete sidewalk or an old gravel alleyway or something and you have to go on soil, I highly recommend that once you construct the box frame, you put geotextile liner at the bottom before you put the pea stone in. If you don't do that, if you build on soil and you don't put this film down, the pea stone gets lost. It works its way down into the soil. And if you ever have to scoop up as you harvest the trees, you're going to be mixing in soil with a pea stone. And it ends up being a less productive bed. And then you can, because there's organic matter in it, you can get diseases, insect issues with it. Depending on what you're going to be healing in, with shrubs, 12 inches of stone is plenty. With almost all trees you'll be working with, 15 to 18 inches of pea stone is way more than enough. Irrigation, they have to be irrigated. And one of the more common questions is like, well, how much do I put down? Well, you put down enough that when you put your hand down in the gravel, once you get down maybe 2 or 3 inches, it's moist. If you look at these trees, they look a little bit mounded. You're not planting trees in a gravel bed, you're healing them in. So what we recommend is you heal them in with 4 or 5, 6 inches of the stone over the root system. And that's gonna be a little bit of insulation, keeping the pea stone from drying out so quickly. If you had the roots right at the surface, you'd be watering all the time. But you just have to figure out yourself, depending on the exposure, depending on the type of irrigation system, how frequently you have to turn on the irrigation system and how long you have to let it run. And the only way to really tell, I mean, you can use a tensiometer, hook it up to a computer if you have more money than you know what to do with, or you can use your hand and just dig down in 2, 3, 4 inches. If it's moist, we're good to go. The pop-up heads, this is a real favorite, and it has a real advantage over the soaker hose in the previous slide. Soaker hoses basically are water fountains for rabbits and squirrels and streaky gophers. And they start, if all they did was lick the water that's coming out of the soaker hose, that'd be no problem. But they don't do it. They are just determined to chew into it. And within a few days, you'll notice you have all these geysers coming out of the gravel bed from the critters chewing through. Pop-up heads like these, it's real easy to set up. It's a very reasonable irrigation setup, so I highly recommend these. All right, this is probably my absolute favorite gravel bed. This is the city of North St. Paul. They had a bunch of old dumpsters. They didn't know what to do with them. If you look to the right, you can see the irrigation system is hooked up to a water hydrant instead of a spigot. But inside that dumpster, there's 1.5 feet of gravel, and they just heal their trees and shrubs right in there. When it's time to plant these out, if they're planting in the park, they just load up the dumpster, take it to the park, pull out the tree. Oh, it's so cool. I love this system. And they didn't invest, they used what they already had. The only investment in it was the cost of the trees. Here's another one of my favorites. This was near a community garden. This is in Fridley, Minnesota. And near this community garden, they had this compost bin that for years, people, when they'd work in the garden, they would just throw the refuse, the organic refuse in it. Well, it wasn't really being used that much. And so they just converted it. They took out the organic matter, put a gravel bottom in it, and this is their gravel bed now. Note the screening to the front. That's to keep critters out. Bunnies, well, not so much squirrels, but bunnies and deer. Keep them out from grazing on the trees. And you can see the hose to the left that's going off to the left to the water source too. And they have, this one is set up with sprinkler heads. Okay, those, we're kind of segueing from the traditional 4-sided bed. And if you notice, especially in this last one in Fridley, the 4th side, those were actually tubes of sand. And if you live in the upper Midwest and you have a 2-wheel drive pickup truck, you've probably bought tubes of sand before in the wintertime to give a little bit of traction. Now we're going to go to a 3-sided bed. So this is at one of our research facilities. And this one in particular, 12 feet wide, This particular one is 40 feet long. And note that there's only 3 sides. And the reason for this is so they can stock it with a tractor and they can harvest it with a tractor with a front end loader. If you heel in a lot of trees in a gravel bed, and they're fast rooting trees like elms and willows and crab apples, it's a lot of work to get those out by hand. And so if you can substitute hand labor with a front end loader and a tractor, it's going to be the best day of your life. This is in Fargo, Minnesota. They took it a little bit fancier, actually. So you can see this is all concrete. It slopes down, and at the bottom of the slope to the right, you can't see it, there are drainage holes. So it actually captures a lot of rainwater that ends up getting down to the root system, to the gravel. And as you can see, they stock it using front end loaders, and they harvest it using a front end loader. This is a permanent system, and they use gravel bed trees for over 80% of the trees that they plant in the city and parks of Fargo. It's such a good system for them. Again, another 3-sided bed. This is this is near Wabasha, Minnesota. And the third side on this is just a quickly removable plank, 2 planks actually. And then they can go in with a front end loader and carefully lift the trees out that way and cut down harvest time to next to nothing. This particular area, you can see they're using soaker hoses. And for whatever reason, they didn't have problems with squirrels and rabbits in this area. So it worked out well for them. To the top right, these look like store-bought, almost like landscape Jersey barriers, but this is in Bemidji, Minnesota. And they pour a lot of concrete up there, sidewalks and streets, etc. So what they did was, at the end of the day, when they come back, if there was excess concrete in the truck, they would pour it into these molds that they made for these blocks. So all these blocks were made from excess concrete. And then they just lift them with a forklift, and they made their beds. So again, this is a 3-sided drive-in bed. And you can see they're installing the Pea Stone now with a front end loader, easy peasy. If you look to the lower left, same thing, we're stocking. This is one of our research beds. And those white things that you see, those are polyurethane Jersey barriers. When they're empty, they weigh 33 pounds a piece. When you fill them with water, and I also put antifreeze in, because I leave them filled year round, they weigh little over 400 pounds. And again, you can see where the forks can slip right underneath them. You can move them around. It's just great. So stocking a bed like this, a 3-sided bed, it's a 2-person operation. Harvesting, it's a 2-person operation. So there are a lot of advantages to it. The simplest and the cheapest, and it works quite well too, is just dump the gravel on the ground. Hopefully you don't dump it on good soil or good grass. But again, in this particular community, and this is Ada, Minnesota, they didn't have a choice. They had to do it somewhere. So they just dumped it. This works perfectly fine. Yes, you're going to have some drifting. Some of that pea stone is going to drift out. It'll take a little bit of extra pea stone, but it works just fine. You don't have to be fancy. And now we're back to Jim Whiting's nursery in Rochester. This is 1/3 acre, and it's all open bed. And the only sides that it has are those tubes of sand. And they're about, I don't know, maybe 8 inches high, 6 or 8 inches high when they're full. And he's, like I said, it's 30 years. This summer's 30 years he's had this bed. He just keeps expanding it. One other thing I want to mention on this, he sells wholesale, but he also sells retail. So when he sells retail out of this commercial bed, each tree shrub comes with a 2-year warranty. If this isn't working for him, he would be bankrupt by now. And obviously it's working for him. This is what I love to see. This is another gravel bed in city of Rochester. And again, most of their trees are gravel bed trees now. Bare rooted trees. This is an old parking lot near the fairgrounds there. Wasn't being used for anything. So they moved in some Jersey barriers just to kind of contain, on 2 sides, contain the pea stone from drifting away. And if you look, there's kind of, it looks like a tripod with 4 legs, and coming up out of the center of that, that's the irrigation head. So it's a big spray head, and that's what they use in here to irrigate. Nice, simple bed, works well, and everything is done with a front end loader and 1 or 2 people. All right, here's another option, an in-ground bed. This is the first bed that I built at a research field. And I want you to note on this, this is 60 feet long and it's 12 feet wide, and it's broken into compartments so we could conduct, different research, different materials, different trees. And this was foolish of me, and I freely admit it, because we don't leave trees, at least on purpose, we don't leave trees in gravel through the winter. I don't know what I was thinking, but I thought, all right, it's cold up here, we better go below ground. Don't do that. Don't do that. If you look in this first bed closest to you, if you look at that far right corner, you see something black. That's a sump pump area. Every time it rains, we had to install the sump pumps in those tubular sleeves and pump out the gravel bed. Do not build a gravel bed below ground. There's no need for it, and it's nothing but a mistake. Okay, now we're going to talk about harvesting and transporting and planting the trees, the fun part. So the fun part's not so fun if you have 100 trees and you have to dig them all out by hand, especially if they're elms that root just like crazy in gravel, or willows or crab apples, or oh my gosh, don't ever put black locust in a gravel bed, not even purple robe, the highly desirable variety, because the roots explode in there, and oh my gosh, it just takes you forever, and it's a back killer to get these trees out. So, but if it's a small bed and you're only producing, 25 or 50 trees, hand harvesting is just fine. Don't buy a tractor with a front end loader. As soon as you pull them out, the easiest thing to do is put them in black plastic bags, garbage bags, and sit them off someplace that's shady. You do not want the sun heating up those black plastic bags, because you're going to parboil the roots. Okay, something happened. I'm going to have to go previous. There we go. The nice thing about a gravel bed too, when it comes to harvest, you can harvest any time. Here we're back in Fargo now. They install the trees in the beds late March, early April. They start pulling them out for planting in mid to late June. So they're really not in there for a long time. But by mid to late June, that kind of spring crush of work, they've kind of gotten past that. And so now they can start devoting time to actually starting to pull the trees and plant them. And we've pulled trees in full leaf, Memorial Day, July the 4th, all through the summer when it's hot. As long as you keep those roots moist, very good transplant success, except for sumac. I do have to say that 100% mortality when I pulled sumac in the middle of the summer, 100% survival if I waited till October. But that was the only tree or shrub that was kind of stinky about it. Like this is typical. This was not dug out with a shovel. This was literally just pulled up crabapple, and you can see nice intact root system, easy peasy. Sometimes if you look at a tree to the left, look at the caliper of that tree. That was a maple tree that was in I think it was a number 20 or 25 container, pop bound. We boxed the root system. We put it in Pea Stone for the summer, pulled it out, and God, look at that root system. It's just a mop of roots. Sometimes when the root system is so thick like this, you have to use a hose. Water, just basically you blast the stone off with water, any stone that's remaining on there. And it just kind of preserves your system. All right. Now, if you're getting the idea that I'm basically lazy, it's because I'm basically lazy. And if I can avoid installing and harvesting trees by hand, I am going to do it. So here we are back in Robbinsdale. Previously, it looked like a 4-sided bed, but it has one end that can be lifted off. So they can go in with front end loader and harvest the trees like they're doing, or stocking the beds too. It just makes things so much easier. This is in the city of Shakopee. They had a rock picker bucket on their Bobcat, their front end loader, and they use this. This is sweet, sweet, sweet. So if you know somebody that has one of these, or if the community has one, this is a wonderful way because it kind of sifts out the gravel as you're scooping it up. So you just grab the tree trunk, kind of shake it for any remaining stone, and harvesting is done. Again, put the trees somewhere, you know, they grow a lot of trees. So they harvest trees like this, they lay them down in the shade, they quick hit them with water to keep them moist. And then to the right, if they're going to be there for any time at all, like for a day or so, they'll spray them with water, and then you can see they're starting to tarp them. And they're going to move these out in mass because they have a really good way of transporting the gravel bed bare root trees. And it's the covered trailer to the left. So once they harvest them and they're ready to take them out and plant them, they load them up in there. And this is a community that's planting literally hundreds and hundreds of bare root trees from their gravel beds. So it's a pretty big operation. And they can just keep them in that self-enclosed container all day while they're planting. Whereas the to the right, that's Hibbing, Minnesota. Oh, they plant out maybe 50 trees a year, and they just bag up the roots, put them in the back of the truck, throw a tarp on them, and everything is good. All right. This is Hennepin County Forestry. So Hennepin County is the largest county in Minnesota, includes Minneapolis. And this particular forestry division with the county, at any one time, they'll have between 1,500 and 2,500 trees in their gravel bed. It's a huge, huge gravel bed, three-sided gravel bed. When it comes time to plant them out, they use volunteers. This is what they do. They take the trees, they dip the root system in a hydrogel solution, which is basically like unflavored gelatin, and it just holds the moisture in the root a little bit longer. Then they put the trees in these number 45 containers. By the way, to the left, you know, Soil Moist is one. There are a lot of brands of it. I'm not promoting Soil Moist. It's just I had a picture of it, and it does look like that dry stuff on the bottom. And I'll make a note on that in a second. But anyway, so once they've dipped it and they're training the volunteers, they put the trees in these number 45 containers, and then they fill the containers with mulch. And then those containers are moved to the site. They're placed exactly where the trees are going to be planted, actually off just a couple inches, a few inches. The people dig the holes, they pull the trees out of the container, plant them, dump the mulch from the container to use as a mulch over the root system of the trees. Done. Perfect system. By the way, when you're mixing up, if you decide to use hydrogel, when you're mixing it up, you're going to be adding this granular, this powder, and you'll be stirring it in, and you're going to be thinking, wow, this isn't really thickening up very much. I think I'll add another cup. Don't do it, because the next thing you know, you have concrete, and it sets up. It's so thick that you can't even get the root system in there. So you just want a slurry. You don't want a paste or anything. So here they are. They're loading them up. This is such a great system, especially if you're using volunteers. And again, with cities that are planting hundreds and sometimes thousands of these trees, anytime they can mechanize is a good operation. So they use these drills attached to their articulated drive tractors, and it just saves a ton of time. And especially if they're having volunteers plant a tree too. So to kind of finish things up, I want to go through quickly through some lessons learned. And if you don't know me, here's a lesson in Gary. I learned almost everything the hard way. I have made so many mistakes, but what I try to do when I make a mistake is figure out why I made that mistake. What did I do that I can correct? So here we go. Above ground beds are the simplest. Do not put them below ground. Monitoring water is challenging. Different trees are going to perform differently. Isn't that something? And gravel beds grow roots. They don't grow stems and twigs, and I'll explain that. And then they're not year-round beds either. So to me, I look at this gravel bed, this is ideal. It's three-sided. You can, install everything. You can harvest everything with a front-end loader. This is going to be your ideal bed. And and it's so easy to take apart too, if you get tired of gravel beds, etc. Monitoring water, you can dump a ton of money. So in one of our research beds, I decided to dump a ton of money because I had it. And I installed a really good pipe system in there. I installed tensiometers that could detect when the moisture level was getting too low, and it would kick on the computer, and the computer then would kick on the water. And, for one bed, it was like $2,500 what it cost me. One of the dumbest things I've ever done. Don't do that. Don't do that. The more money you put into something, the more frequently it's going to break down. So here's what I recommend. These pop-up heads and the polyethylene tubing. This stuff is so inexpensive. Go for that. If you don't have rabbits or squirrels, you can use soaker heads. If you look at that meter to the left, you can get that at like Home Depot or Menards or Lowe's. It's less than $40. That is all you need. You're going to decide when you set the dials if it's going to come on, 4 times a day, and when it comes on, it's going to run for 10 minutes. You're going to determine that because you're going to be digging down into that gravel to make sure that there's moisture there. Now, if you want to be real frugal with moisture, where you set up your gravel bed is incredibly important. And there's 2 things. Do not set it up where, if you can avoid this, do not set it up where you have a lot of wind, because that's just going to dry it out faster. And the second thing is, if you can set it up on a north side or an east side or some exposure where it's shaded for most of the day, it's going to be the best day of your life. So shading is important, and keep it out of the wind. And then use your hands to figure out, okay, it needs to be watered again. But when's the last time I watered it? 8 hours ago. Okay, I'm going to set the timer for every 8 hours. And you can figure out how long to let it run too. All right, different actors, different performances. I look at this root system. This is off an oak. It's not bad. It was a smaller oak. It's not bad. It's kind of so-so. I look at this root system, holy buckets. That's a nice, this is what I want to see coming out of gravel too. Nice fibrous root system. And one of the nice things about having a fibrous root system, you're rarely going to have to stake these trees to keep them vertical. Just imagine the weight of all the soil on this very fibrous root system, and that's usually enough to keep it vertical. So, just encapsulating just a few examples, the species performance of honey locust, coffee trees, smaller trees in general, maples, birches just explode. Arborvitae, I don't know why you'd grow arborvitae any other way. I would just automatically put them right in gravel. They do swell in it. The worst, oddly enough, little leaf linden. I already talked about sumac. You can only, I just wouldn't even do it anymore, quite honestly. And then calipered hackberry, small hackberry, 3, 4, 5 foot hackberry does great. If it's calipered, 1.5, 1 3/4. Same thing with the oaks. If you stick with hackberries and oaks that are up to, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, they're going to do well. But once they get too big calipers of a caliper, they don't do well. This is very typical for arborvitae. Look at that root system. Isn't that beautiful? No, I'm sorry. Couldn't take my eyes off that. This is typical for a Norway spruce. Very, very nice root system for a Norway spruce. This is going to do so much better than planting out a seedling. All right, where can you go for information? We have over 100 examples of different trees, species, shrubs, etc. And if you look at this website, www.trees.umn.edu, click on the top banner, click on Outreach, then click on Gravel Bed, and then click on 2021 Community Gravel Bed Guide. That was my latest publication. And you can see in here that, for instance, we'll look at Norway maple. We tested out 20 trees. They're inch and a half to 1.75 inch caliper. Suitability, How well did they do in the gravel bed? It was good. Transplanting, success, good. And when can you transplant them? You can pull them and plant them summer through the autumn. And we push the envelope on autumn. I have planted the first week of December more than once. It's not fun. I wouldn't recommend do it. I do it because it's research and I'm not the brightest bulb in the tree. The other thing, gravel beds, they grow roots. They don't grow stems and branches. So all the energy that the tree has when it goes into the gravel bed, it's going to the root system. So if you want a 8-foot tall tree, by the time you pull that tree out of the gravel bed, you should plant an 8-foot tall tree because it's just not going to put on much. It's not going to put on much growth above ground. All the growth is going to be occurring below ground. So it's not that big of a deal. I just want you to know. And by the way, somebody is going to say, well, how about if we fertilize it? Fertilizing a gravel bed is like taking the fertilizer and flushing it down the toilet. Just think about it. The gravel has no capacity to hold the nutrients, and you're irrigating once, twice, 3, 4 times a day sometimes, and it's just flushing those nutrients. So it's a waste of time and money. Gravel beds are not year-round beds. If you decide, or if the autumn gets away from you and you can't get them all planted, if you think that, oh, I wonder if they're going to make it through the winter, they will make it through the winter, except that it becomes a buffet. This is like old country buffet for deer and rabbits and voles and everything. So if you're going to leave them in a gravel bed in the winter, you have to give either the entire gravel bed wire fencing protection. And if you have voles in the area, that means 1/4-inch hardware cloth. Or if they're just single stem trees, you can use tree stem protectors. You're going to have to do it. Otherwise, the trees are just going to be girdled. All of them will be girdled. Can you imagine a rabbit or a vole or a deer coming up and seeing 100 trees all in 60 square feet? It's like they thought they've died, gone to heaven. So anyway, those are the last of my lessons learned. Just acknowledgement, these are the many, many people. All this research that in earnest started in 2006 was funded by one anonymous and very generous tree lover who thought that bees and trees were the answer to all the problems in the world. And I still thank that person for funding all of our work, but all these other people too, right down to the nurseries. Nurseries have been so generous, donating plant materials and other materials too. So couldn't have done it without these people. So again, name's Gary Johnson, University of Minnesota, Professor Emeritus, which is just a fancy word for old, retired, but they still let me have an office professor. And I hope this has helped you. Thanks for listening.